Wish you were one of those influencers with raving fans who binge on your every word, consume all your content, buy everything you have to sell, and demand even more? Then stay tuned while Authority Magazine columnist and BuzzFeed contributor Tracy Hazard shares strategies, tips, and tactics from top videocasters, podcasters, authors, and social influencers on creating that bingeable factor. Now, let's join Tracy as she explores how to rise above all the digital noise with the binge factor.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Binge Factor. I'm Tracy Hazard, and I have a podcaster who's also a producer today, and they always have great insights, and I love my conversation with Carl Richards, our guest today, so we can talk about the differences in some of the Canadian market issues and the U.S. market issues, and really talk about, the common problems that are going on with people starting podcasts, keeping motivated for podcasts, and what's generally going on in the industry. Carl Richards has the Podcast Solutions Made Simple podcast and business. He spent more than 25 years behind the microphone on radio, on stage, entertaining, influencing audiences worldwide. He's a 3 times best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and MC. He's the host of 2 podcasts and is the founder and CEO of Podcast Solutions Made Simple. He helps coaches, consultants, and subject matter experts become the go-to expert and elevate their credibility by launching world-class podcasts. He lives in Ontario, Canada, where he enjoys camping and boating in the Thousand Islands, and he's got a great perspective on how the Canadian market's a little different. And we discussed this before the interview, so you didn't get to hear that part because I didn't turn on the recording for that. But we discussed there's a little bit of difference. The Canadian listening audience isn't only smaller just because Canada's smaller. It's smaller in that there hasn't just been quite the same embracement of podcasting from a broader audience of creators. And that's been a really interesting tell. They've not embraced it at the same pace and rate that we have here in the US. So thinking about that, is your audience all going to be Canadians? But if not, and you're a Canadian podcaster and you want to get into the US audience, might be ideal because there's not as many of you. So this is something that someone like Carl Richards can really give us insights into. So let's talk Podcast Solutions Made Simple. And let's talk to Carl Richards. Carl, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have Podcast Solutions Made Simple for us to discuss here because you know what? I think that we don't think of podcasting as a solution that often in the industry. We don't talk about it that way.
No, we don't. We don't even talk about it quite often, actually. I think that's one of the challenges. We talk about everything else, but podcasting seems to be rearing its head, and I almost said ugly head, but it's not actually ugly at all. It just seems ugly if you're not sure of what's going on in this space. But it seems to be creeping into conversations a lot more, as you know, Tracy, in the last few years. It's really coming to the fold. But there is an easy way to go about it, and it can be a solution for the right business owner or coach or consultant or something like that who really wants to look at doing something different for their marketing or promotional strategy that maybe was relying on a lot of conventional systems up until then, and now they're looking at something different.
Well, yeah, when it starts to head into mainstream and you start seeing on regular, I always think back to like when podcasting becomes like the cool job to have on a sitcom, right? Like, and it's the cool job to have on a sitcom. And then recently I just saw, I think it was the second season of The Lincoln Lawyer, where where the podcaster is the bad guy. And of course I kept saying to my partner and husband, I kept saying, there's no way he made that much money podcasting. Like nobody makes that money. I was like, not for that show. Like,
not typically.
Not typically. I was like, that's not realistic. But anyway, when it hits that mainstream, that you're starting to get into that tipping point of where it really is a part of the conversation. Absolutely. And people then start looking, going, maybe I should start a podcast. And that's where you sort of step right into them. And that's really the focus of your show, is making sure that they understand that that it's a bigger program than just podcasting.
Exactly. I mean, anyone can start a podcast. If you can fog a mirror, you can have a podcast. I think the difference, though, is for people who look at the space and go, I want a podcast, but I want it to do something, or I want it to have some value. I want it to speak to my passion project or my hobby or my business, because that's obviously a lot of the people we work with are thinking of it from a business perspective. But at the end of the day, if you're getting your message out, that's the key is what, and that's one of the things we get right into is what is your message or what's your purpose for being here? And if it's just to spew, okay, that's still a purpose. Is that something though that is really going to bring you what you expect from the show? So there are many different things that we look at, and that's one of the first questions we ask is, what's the podcast going to be about, and what's the purpose of it, before we even dive into any of the other minutia of what the show or what having a show means.
Well, and I think it's so hard for someone to get over their hangups about it. There's a lot of myths around starting a podcast, and
Okay.
you talk a lot about these 5 myths. So
Yeah.
let's debunk them here and let's like kind of get through them here and let's talk about what gets people stuck.
Yeah, you know what? And you've probably heard these before or stumbled on them, or maybe even when you were getting started, had some of these yourself. But the first one is the money myth. And the money myth can be viewed a few different ways. It can be it's too expensive or not seeing the value in it. And, it's because of the perception of what we think a podcast is going to cost and see, am I going to get my money's worth out of it? Am I going to get my money back from having a podcast? Where we need to think of what the value of that podcast will bring you. So when I'm working with business owners, I'll say, okay, well, what's the value of a client? Is it $50,000? Is it $100,000? Because I know that you can probably have a podcast for less than that. What's the value of that client by getting the word out about what it is that you do? So that's the myth number one is seeing the value in having a show and elevating your credibility and seeing you or having you be seen as the expert. And as soon as you start talking in those terms, some people, they go, okay, yeah, I'm sold, because I need to be seen as the expert and not be in the shadows hiding behind everybody else. I need to be up front and out there.
Well, and I think that is also a myth. Like there's a lot of people out there that putting out the message that it costs nothing to start a podcast. You just
Yeah.
use your iPhone and you don't have to make any investment. And that's also, I think, a huge mistake. Like it does a complete disservice to your expectations. You will not be able to professionally compete in most of your business categories unless you invest something in the show. Like you can't
Oh,
do nothing.
absolutely. I mean, I remember seeing Sam Crowley, who's had a podcast since podcasts were in diapers, right? And I remember going to one of his workshops in Toronto, and he said, "You know what? You can start a podcast for $0." Yes, you can. However, if you really want to excel in that space, or if it's something you're going to do for business, I mean, you wouldn't print. I'm dating myself, maybe you wouldn't print business cards for free on just 8.5 by 11, lined paper, because it wouldn't look right. Right. So the same reason why you'd want to invest a couple of dollars in professional services, just like you do, Tracy, and I do. I actually, that's what I do. But because you're going to get something out of it that would be different. So, but the myth of it, you could just do it on $0. Yeah, it is a huge misconception. The second myth is also, I would say, is the content myth. It's that, what am I going to talk about? There's so much content out there already. What am I going to talk about? And I quite often will share with people, you already have the content. By the time people come to me and say, hey, I'd like a podcast, when they say, I don't know what to talk about, though, I say, yeah, you do. It's your workshops, it's your webinars, it's your blogs, it's your all of those things that you've already created, your checklists, your PDFs, your ebook, whatever it is. That's where your content's coming from. So it's not about content creation, it's about content curation. So it's podcast ready. And therefore,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, right. And I find that's often misaligned. Like when I review a show here is that there's a misalignment between the audience that they think they have and the
Yes.
audience they're actually speaking to are not always aligned.
Well, that goes back to client avatar, right? And knowing who your audience is. And for some people, when they do come into this space, they're not really sure. They're like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. But really, once you identify, okay, yes, this is my client, and I'm speaking to, for example, for me, it took me a long time to figure out who my client is. And when I say subject matter experts, it's because I know that those are the people who are most likely to step into the podcasting realm. If I was looking for hobbyists, my language to hobbyists would be different. And
Right.
if
Yeah,
I
we have
narrowed
to
it down
align it.
and if I narrowed it down and said, instead of just hobbyists, which is also a very broad term, if I said gardeners, okay, well, now we're getting really specific and your messaging is there. But that really helps you in positioning your content when you know exactly who you're talking to. But it keeps people stuck because they just don't know, because they hear podcasts and they go, oh, I don't know if I can sound like that, which is another myth. That's the third one. It's the competition myth. There's a lot of them out there already, and I don't know if I'm good enough as Tracy Hazard, as Carl Richards, as Joe Rogan, as you name them. And you know what? There's more than enough space for other people to come into this podcasting, playing field. And there is also a huge variety of personalities, styles of shows, all of those things. So the fact that you don't think that you have a space here is ludicrous, really, when you think about it.
Well, no, especially when there's only 300,000 active shows in
Exactly.
English speaking, right? So there's,
Exactly.
out of the 3 million, there's only 300,000 active. So it says something that there's definitely a space for you.
100%, 100%. We talk about the tech myth as well. That's the fourth one.
Yeah, we get that one a lot.
Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? What's a pod? What's a host site? And we use Buzzsprout for our clients, but there's so many of them out there, and it really confuses people when you start talking technical things. And that's why I say, you know what, we'll take care of that. You just need to know that there is a tech side to this. And if that's not in your wheelhouse, that's what we do. But understanding that there is tech to it, there is some techie things that you might need to do. But it's just like the reason why I don't fix my own car is because firstly, my spouse would run outside saying, "What are you doing?" That's number one.
I'm afraid to get in the car now.
Exactly. But I'm not a car guy. I'm not a guy that can lift the hood and go, "Oh, it's this," which would be weird because I have a Tesla now. There's no hood to lift. It's a frunk, right? Whatever they call it. So it's the same thing. You wouldn't just think to fix your car if you didn't know how to do it, right? You take to the expert, which is what we say to people. So you know what? We'll help you in the tech space. And the other one is, no surprise here, Tracy, it's time.
Yeah.
I don't have time to have a podcast. I don't have time to do this. And it's not whether or not you have time to have a podcast. It's whether or not you have, managed your time accordingly. And whether or not, it's not, one of my clients said it very, very succinctly. She said, it wasn't, how am I going to find the time to do this? That was her stopgap. It's like, how am I going to find the time to do this? When she switched the language and said, who am I going to find to do this or help me do this? All of a sudden the world changed for her. So really understanding that, yes, it will take some time, but it will take you the same amount of time to schedule a blog post or do a Facebook Live or do any of those other things that we do as it does to do a podcast. So why not save yourself some time and curate your content and do all of them succinctly?
Well, and that's where I like to start. I like to start with, what am I spending my time on right now? Yeah. And how can I use that for podcasting instead?
Yeah.
Like, that's how I always look at it. And so, like, we just got off our live coaching call that we do for our clients every single week on Wednesdays that we're recording this on. And I just finished it and we use that for our podcast. But I was going to do it anyway, because I need to nurture my community. So why not repurpose it and use it for the podcast? So you finding ways to fit that in, I think, is much better strategy, because then you're actually looking at, I'm actually saving time. I'm actually saving money. Right?
Absolutely. And it actually goes back to content as well. When we talk about content creation versus content curation, yeah, we can create a ton of content, or we could take content we've already created and curate it into something else. So if you've written a blog post, okay, well, now that becomes the framework for my podcast. You talk about this class that you run, that becomes now the framework for something else. Are you going to switch it up here and there? You might. Or it might be exactly the same. I've seen people do that before, where they'll record a class and that becomes their episode, depending on what genre they're in for their show. So there's all different ways to look at it. And once you've gotten past that, it's a matter of just saying, and I know we've heard this before in so many different things, but I'm going to do this, and just doing it. Taking that first step is probably the hardest thing to do.
Well, let's talk about your show that way. And you,
okay.
What was that first thing what was that one you had to get over to start your show?
Oh my goodness. Which one? How you talk? So I have two podcasts, actually. I have the one that I launched that got me into the podcasting space. And that was a Speaking of Speaking podcast. And I think the big thing there for me was, and it took me a long time. I first heard about podcasting in 2012. And at that time, I was doing speaker training. And I remember saying to a colleague who said, you should have a podcast. It'd be great for you as a speaker. And I remember saying, what's a podcast? And why would a speaker trainer, again, this is 2012, why would a speaker trainer want to have a show? As a speaker trainer, I'm helping people get on stages. not getting on something that seems like some crazy version of radio. I'm trying to get them on a physical stage. Why would I want to get them on a podcast? Why would I want to talk about that? So it took me 7 years to wrap my head, almost 7 years, to wrap my head around that concept. Once I did that, and actually it was also being at Sam Crowley's event where I realized, okay, yes, I can do this and I can have a podcast, then I realized that, so it wasn't even the tech myth. It was convincing me that this is a real thing. This is something
which was
that,
harder in the early days. Look, I mean, when we
yeah,
started our first show in 2014 and people were the same way, they were like, you have a podcast? Why? Because our podcast was on 3D printing, which seemed like a visual media.
yeah,
Like, why is
yeah,
it being done in podcasting? And it was very successful. So yeah, it was in the early days, it was a lot harder to grasp the power of podcasting. Now we kind of
absolutely.
get the opposite. It's like everyone and their brother has a podcast. So why should I? Like, that's the other why
Yeah,
that comes into it. Why is
yeah,
it a value still? And
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't have a specific myth. I think I spent 25 years in radio broadcasting, so I wasn't mic shy. I knew how to create content. I knew how to edit content. So it was more of and as far as the technical side of podcasting goes, understanding, how do you take it from a recording to actually getting it on some of the playback sites, the Apples, the Spotifys, and all of those. I didn't know how to do that. I had no clue how to do that. So that was a technical hurdle for me. But I think, as I said, it was more the proof of concept. Why should I have a show? What's the value to me as a business owner? And I'll say what a lot of people have probably said. You probably heard this before. If I had started my podcast back in 2012 or 13 or 14, when somebody said you should do a podcast, I'd be so much further ahead. But there's no right or wrong time to start. Just start. But it was that proof of concept, I think, that was really the holdback for me.
Well, I start a new podcast every single year to just see what it's like for clients and understand what it's going for. And you're absolutely right. My old shows could still outdo my current shows. There's no way around it. They have a momentum that is hard to
Mm,
beat, but it is still a better purpose that you're starting from. And I think that's really, I love that that was one of the things that you focus on with your clients, is starting with that. Why are you doing this? What's its purpose?
yeah,
What's the outcome that you're going to achieve from this? Because you can't get to that why without that, really understanding that as the crux of what show should you create, all
yeah,
stems off of that. Nothing should be done until you've solved that question for yourself. And sometimes it is an experiment. I'm good with that. Like, my show was
absolutely.
an experiment. When I first started, it was a successful one. And in 5 months, I knew it was working, but you just don't always know who my audience is going to be. Maybe you're going to be wrong in your
Yeah,
selection, and right. But you might be surprised by the results. And as long as that's what I love about podcasting, the
yeah,
flexibility of it. Flex with it,
yeah.
right? Change it.
It's okay to be wrong, and it's also okay to be right.
Yeah.
That's the other cool thing. It's okay to be right and wrong almost at the same time. It's interesting though, because I will have prospects who will come to me and they'll say, well, my coach said I need a podcast. I'm like, okay, well,
I get that a lot.
we can talk about this, but does your coach understand, is your coach the person that's helped you with your client avatar? Do you know who your client avatar is? Do you know what the purpose of your show is going to be? Do you know who your target audience is going to be? And this is vernacular that we talked about in radio all the time. Who's your target audience? What does your listener look like? And when I was going up through the ranks in my early years in broadcasting, it was almost like, I don't want to talk about that. I just want to get on the radio and have some fun. But you
Just want
have
to
to
do it.
understand who you're talking to, right? So
Right.
you need to understand when you're getting into that space. Yes, you can make mistakes, and yes, it's going to be exciting as you do that, as a, or as you indicated, test it out and see if it's going to work. Dip your toe in the water, or jump in head first, or feet first, whichever's easier. Probably feet first, just to see
Yeah,
if
let's
it's
do
going to.
that.
Yeah,
Let's
let's do
not
feet
drown.
first, just to see if it's going to work. But it's okay to do that. But you should be doing it because this is something that you're seeing as value, not somebody saying you should do a podcast, or a coach saying, I think it's time for you to do a podcast. When, if your coach doesn't have a podcast, I would say, okay, coach, you're telling me I need a podcast. Why don't you have one?
Right. And this is the thing. This is what I always say. I can't record for you. So unless your coach is going to record for you,
Yeah.
it has to still be
Yeah.
right for you at the end of the day, right? I can
Yeah.
motivate myself to record. I don't know what's wrong with you. Like, you've got to
Yeah.
figure that out for yourself. You've got to have your own motivation system, right?
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not
Yeah.
going to change. Well, let's talk a little bit about this, because I mean, a lot of the industry, I mean, they dip their toe in, right? Like, I mean, I'm being nice about it. You and I both know there's a gigantic pod fade rate. It's at 89% right now. I just pulled the numbers in the last week. It's at 89%. And the average pod fade show doesn't make it to 15 episodes.
Yeah, those are phenomenal numbers. I didn't know they were that bad.
It's gotten
Actually,
worse. Like a year ago, it was different. So
yeah, I actually tell people that about 40% of shows out there are not active anymore. But I think pod fade happens because, again, I don't think we go in it. I think some of us approach the podcasting space, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges. We approach the podcasting space and we see it as a short game, not a long game. Or we see it as a get rich quick or get recognition quick solution. And anyone that's been around long enough will tell you podcasting is the opposite. It's a long game. If you want to see your show grow, you want to see, I'll say numbers, but you want to have more listeners. You might not see that in your first 10 to 15 episodes. It might take you 30, 40, 50 episodes before you see large numbers. And I know that, I don't know if we're going to talk about this or not, but podcasting in the United States versus podcasting in Canada and other parts of the world is a completely different game. Even though it's global, it's a completely different game. But a lot of us think that, well, if a guy like, and we also compare. So if we say, well, a guy like Joe Rogan can get however many, 11 billion listeners, as Carl Richards, I must be able to get half of that. Well, we forget that Joe Rogan, not to give him all the love and publicity on your show, but he's the guy that used to make us eat goofy stuff and, run up, 100% steep cliffs and call that fear factor. Right. So
and he had an audience to start with. That's what I keep trying to say to him. He already had them. He moved them into podcasting.
Exactly.
Like it was the difference. Are you going to do that?
Exactly. And that's why when people say, well, I want to start a show, I'll say, well, one of the discussions we'll have is, what's your audience size now? What's the size of your email list? What's your Facebook? What's your LinkedIn? What's your Instagram? And it's not to dissuade someone from being in the space, but it's to see, do you have an audience already that you can talk to, that you can build on? You need to be able to build on that audience. Somebody like, I'll pick another name, Oprah Winfrey. As soon as she wakes up in the morning, she's making money. She doesn't even have to get out of bed. She's making money, right? So, and I don't know how many podcasts she's on or has. I know she's on a few of them, but that's because she's already built that celebrity, that she's been through those trenches already. So that's why I think there's a certain amount of pod fade, is because we go in there thinking, I have a podcast, bring me the listeners. It doesn't work that way.
I also want to highlight this, Carl, because this is where you essentially fill that gap. That's tremendous, is that we think podcasting is so easy. So we're going to go into it and not consult the pros. We just listened to that coach who said we should start it. So we were like, oh, okay, we'll watch a couple of videos and we'll just start it ourselves. And what we're forgetting is that there is a base of knowledge underneath there. There's a base of knowledge of what works and what doesn't. So it's great 100%. That we're working on the conceptual side of why we're doing this and all of those things, but there's still all these technical things underneath it that if we don't do them too, it doesn't work. And we don't get pros in to help us enough. I see it so often. I watch a great show and I'm like, well, if you had done this, and this, then maybe people would have found your show and you wouldn't have had a pod fade. Like, and there were 5 dumb things you could have done in 5 minutes. Like, it's not difficult, but we never ask the pro.
It is rare that people will ask the pros. I'm on a mission to change that. And
I was hoping you were. That's why I was throwing you this question.
I come from a very different angle too, because there are a number of people out there, podcasters and even people who run podcasting agencies like mine, who don't have a broadcast background. So I have a broadcast background. I have a very keen ear and eye. I mean, more ear. I spent more time in radio than in television. I have so much experience in that space. I know what sounds good. I know how something should sound. I know how an interview should flow, so it doesn't sound like an interview. It sounds like you're just having coffee across the kitchen table with a friend. That's a skill. That takes not just a couple of recordings to perfect. It takes years. And in some cases, you might never get it. I'm not saying don't do a podcast if you're not a skilled interviewer, but there's a certain skill behind it about having those conversations. And that doesn't happen overnight. And I think a lot of podcasters get frustrated because maybe they'll listen back and go, oh, I sound horrible. I used to do that when I was a young broadcaster. I'd listen to myself and say, I hate the way I sound. Most people hate the way they sound, and most people hate the way they look. You have to get over that piece.
You will get over it. Trust me. You will eventually get over it.
You do. Exactly.
But here's what I see happen so often. So I would agree with you. There's a lot of people without a broadcast background, but there are also a lot of broadcasters without a tech background. And if you don't have a good combination of both, you better get a partner. You better get a good assistant in that process. And, you mentioned your hosting company, and I'm going to say they're the worst ones out there. They're actually harming them from a technical standpoint.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful with who we're partnering up with as agencies, because the tech is actually critically important, because no one discovers your show if you don't show up in the search engine. Like, it's just not going to happen. Right. So those are important things. But I think too often podcasters don't listen to their own show. And if you don't go back and see what the listening experience is, right? Like, and that's something that I think happens here on my show a lot, is that I listen to the show, and I listen to many of your shows in a row so that I can get a binge listener experience, so I can discover your binge factor, which I'm about to say here. But, when I do that, I think sometimes it's an aha to the host back, that they were like, oh, I forgot that number one rule. I really should check out what the end product looks like, right? I should open up my own box and check it out and see what it's like to experience it from the outside. And that we fail to do that a lot.
It's so true. And I'll speak to it as a former broadcaster, I'll speak to it from that perspective too, because for me, sitting in front of the microphone, creating content all the time, when I was doing the morning show, I'd have 8 pieces of content to deliver every hour. 8. That's not including the folks that would come in and do the news and the updated weather and all that stuff. I had 8 of my own pieces of content to deliver every hour. I have a 4-hour morning show. That's 16 pieces of content every show, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. Do the math. You're not going to go back and listen to every single piece and assess it. So I refer to that as garbage in, garbage out, because I would have people who would come to me when I worked in radio. They'd come up and say, I heard your show the other day. And I'd say, okay, what day? They say, yeah, you were talking about such and such. And in some cases I would go, okay, because I've forgotten, because it's literally garbage in, garbage out. I was
like, how did it feel while I was doing it? That's a lot of what we do here, right?
Yeah.
This is a lot of what we do. So how did it feel while I was doing this? And I don't go back and I don't listen.
Yeah.
But it if you're not going to do that, then you need somebody outside who's a pro at that, who can come in with the good ears, like you were talking about, and check it out and see what the experience is like.
There's definitely a huge value to that. And if you as the host isn't going to do it, it might actually, to your point, Tracy, it might be easier if it's not you doing it. Either have a buddy or have a coach or somebody that can be the listener, that can give you the listener feedback, as opposed to you browbeating yourself and saying, oh,
that wasn't good enough.
I said it like that. I can't believe I wiped my mouth like this on camera. Like, that's
I'm always rubbing my nose,
stuff.
right?
I scratch my nose again. What's up with that? I rub my head too much. I move my glasses, whatever it is. You're going to, if you get a listener or a viewer, your spouse is probably a really good one.
You're doing that thing again. No,
or a kid or something like that. Somebody who is
I always say, this is the thing that I always used to say when I did a lot of product design and development in my career. And over time, it's so often you ask your friends and family what they think. And that's a bad idea, actually.
Yeah.
And sometimes asking your coach is also a bad idea, because they're selling you something, right? So they're going to tell you more, right? So they're going to see an opportunity in that. But if you focus on making sure that you're checking with the ideal audience and what did they think, what did they receive it at, how did they hear it, makes a huge difference. And that's what I think is going on great in your show here, is that, look, there's a lot of podcasting shows. There's a lot of how to podcast shows. There's a lot of, I think in the last 6 months, I probably interviewed 20. So there's a lot of agency owners out there, right? But
Yeah.
your binge
Yeah.
factor on your show is that you're really not focusing on that. You're focusing on a key concept in each show. Might be, a way to market, might be a way to grow your email list. It might be you're focusing on a key concept that supports your podcasting
Yeah.
ecosystem as a whole that they may not realize or understand is a part of podcasting. But if you have no
Right.
email list, you don't have a podcast, or you're not going to ever mind your podcast and turn it into something. Like, it's not going to happen. An email list
Right.
is essential, right?
Right.
But
For sure.
But giving a speech and lecture on that isn't going to help. And instead, you're doing it with a great interview and a great conversation, and you're getting
Right.
across the essence of the importance of one of these items. And I
Right.
think that that's a really great way to build both content that you can utilize and things that you can refer clients to, which is always a great process, right? You have a client that has a problem. Oh, I did an interview with so-and-so. Here it is. It's a really great, substitute and solution process. I think that at the end of the day is really what makes the show more bingeable, because once they listen to that one, they go, that was really great. Let me see what else he has. And then they go through the library. And that's how we get through our library. That creates a binge factor right there. And that's what Carl Richards is doing so well on Podcast Solutions Made Simple.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I appreciate the feedback and the binge factor. Is that what we're calling it?
That's what we call it
Binge
here.
factor. Okay, cool. That feedback, because that now helps me. Firstly, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I wanted to position the show that way, that it wasn't just about here's how you do this for your podcast, not just to be about instructional. I think maybe at one point I thought about that, and there might be episodes that do fall into that category, but I think for most of them, like you said, I'm thinking about it outside of the box, outside of the here's how you do this, the tutorial, the instructional type. It's more of the conversational and also concepts that help people understand the space that much more. If that makes sense.
No, and I think that's good. That's a focus. And it's something that you probably have naturally shifted without realizing it. Like it may be, like you said, you started a couple of those how-to and you were like, they just didn't land right. They didn't feel great to you. And the next thing you know, you've moved on to it. That's kind of a natural professional way to approach it, right? You're going to say, that wasn't right. That wasn't what I wanted. And then you do something, you get feedback, and you go, I'll do more of that. So
with the podcast I started back in 2019, that was all about speaker training. That's exactly what it was. It was that tutorial, tips to standing on stage, tips to gesturing, which is hard to explain for audio.
Oh no, I took
right?
that into the past, into the future, right?
Yeah, it's very, and I think at some point it shifted from being speaker training tips and tricks to overall communication strategies. And there's many different things that fit into that. And during the pandemic, we explored many different things that fit into that variety. So it's interesting that I shifted it for one podcast. And as I shifted it for that one, it almost inherently became the platform for another one.
Right. Right. Yeah. So what do you think the biggest challenge, I'm going to say, keeping your clients motivated, keeping them engaged, keeping them involved in their podcast? What are some tactics that you utilize with them?
I think the biggest one is I encourage them to revisit their show, like really lift the hood of their show and say, hey, let's take a look at it. Let's not just look at how many people are listening. That's a metric, and we can always look at that as a measure of success. But let's look at what we're doing. Let's look at the content we're putting out there. Because if we're only doing, for example, if we're only doing one kind of content, if we're only doing interviews, is that allowing the show to grow? Is that watering down the content? If we're only looking at it as an interview-based podcast, what are you missing out on potentially? So we're always looking at what can we do to elevate the content? Are there features within the show that we can use to elevate the content? Are there things such as, emails from listeners that you want to embrace? I mean, I know it sounds in some, because we've done that for so long, but for the right podcast, it might work. I'm not saying it works for all, but it might work for the right podcast. Are there other things or other elements that you want to bring to the show that maybe you hadn't thought about yet?
Yeah,
So
I'm
we're
not a
always-
big fan of the download measurement. Like I think it's
yeah.
like getting on the scale every day. It can be very demoralizing, right? It's not a
Oh.
good idea. But there's some good data in there and some good things to analyze and think about. And you talk about lifting the hood. I like that. I really like that concept.
Yeah.
And what are some things that you look at when you're analyzing someone's show for them?
But when we analyze somebody's show, we look at firstly we'll look at the content, the quality of the content. Is it content that somebody can listen to? So when I'm listening, when I'm doing an audit, call it an audit for a show, I'll listen and I'll say, yep, this is a great show, and here's what I like about it. Or I'll make comments about what is not sitting well with me. Is it if it's not speaking to me, if it's not conversational enough, if it's too much fact and not enough time for me to absorb the information. So we'll certainly look at that, but we'll also look at other things like, are you sharing information that is could be getting you in trouble? For example, we've done audits where people in real estate have been giving financial advice. I'm like, that's a no-no, because that could get you in some pretty hot water with the right associations and agencies. You know what I mean? But then we'll also look at we look at the goal. We consistently revisit that goal. And if you're
I
not
think that's
achieving
the
that
problem,
goal,
right? Is
yeah,
that if you are not looking at, if you look at a podcast and you're comparing all of them the same way, and there
yeah,
are a lot of these cookie cutter professional agency services out of there, like a
yeah,
lot of them, they
yeah,
apply the same advice to everyone, and it
yeah.
doesn't work if
No,
your goal is something different, right? If
absolutely.
if I said if your whole goal was to mine your guests to have them become agency clients, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
It's a totally different set of advice than if you're mining your listeners to become agency clients. Totally
exactly.
different.
100%. And no two shows are the same either.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to share with the client who's a real estate investor who's speaking to a very specific audience will be different from the client I'm speaking to who's a business coach. Will be different from the client I'm speaking to who is an oncologist. Will be different from the person who I'm speaking to who is a gin enthusiast and becoming an expert in that field. And yes, we do have a podcast like that, by the way, Vet Service. So they're
There are
all
actually
different.
quite a few. So
They're all different though, and the goals will be different. So what I say might work for the gin podcast, might not work for the real estate investing podcast or the business podcast or the oncology podcast. And by the way, those aren't the names of the shows. I'm just giving you examples because they are all different.
yeah.
All different.
So Carl, what's next for you, your show, your agency?
Oh my goodness. We're busy. We can always be busier, by the way. We're doors are open. Come on in. Fire sale. No, I'm just kidding. There's never a fire sale. But no, we're having fun. And we would really like to continue to get the word out, not just about what it is that we do, but about the power of this platform, the power that the podcasting, I'll say medium, because it pretty much is a medium, right? The power that it brings not only can bring an audience and how it can shift ideas, but how it can shift you internally, your thoughts, your beliefs, but how it can also shift your business, your branding, your credibility in that space. So we want to continue to get that message out, which is one of the reasons why you'd figure the guy that has podcasts has been on a lot of podcasts other than his. No. So that's the goal, is to continuously get that message out and share that with people. And for those who want to convert themselves to clients or see themselves doing this and they need some help, we're more than happy to have a conversation with them about that too.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Carl, I am so glad you were representing, above the border here in Canada, because we do need more Canadian podcasters. I totally agree with that. And, I think that to find the success that USA businesses have, they need to compete as well. And I love to see that. Coming from someone who lived just across the border in Canada twice. I lived over in Rochester and in Chautauqua, so just across the border over there on that eastern side. But I love that you're focusing on that, because there really is more of a necessity to make sure that you're standing out, that you're rising above, that you're getting that purpose in there. So thank you for bringing podcasting into a new realm and into a new level.
Well, thank you. And Rochester, we're literally right across the river. Literally, I can't look across the river and see where you lived, but it's that close. There's a little bit of road to get there, but
there's a little bit, yeah. So,
yeah.
Well, we actually interviewed someone on this show. I'll have to make an introduction for you to Rochester Business Daily and or the Rochester Business Show, something like that.
Okay.
And right there, so you guys should definitely interview each other. That would be fun. Sure. So great. Well, thank you, Carl. So appreciate you.
Thank you, Tracy, for so much for having me on.
So I love when we can talk a little industry insider stuff and just get the insights on what's working, what's not. And it was so gracious of Carl to share his 5 myths. Money, content, competition, tech, and time are some of the biggest problems that podcasters have getting started. There are these myths they have about how the industry works or how podcasting works, and they're really not all true. And I think that that's really interesting that he's kind of dialed it into that's his area where he really excels at helping them overcome. That gives him a great model for who he's going to coach, how he's going to coach, and how he's going to keep them motivated and moving and overcoming those obstacles on their way to podcasting and business marketing, right? Because it's one and the same. I also really, liked the aha about a broadcasting background being very valuable. And while I don't disagree with that, I do disagree with it being predominant. And we have so many coaches out there that's the only thing that they're really good at, helping you develop a show concept or learning how to get confidence behind the mic. You need someone like Carl Richards, like other people that we've interviewed on this show, where they have a broader background, where they can fill the tech gap, they can fill the marketing gap, the business gap. And because of his experience, Carl's experience specifically in being a speaker on stages and selling business and selling from the stage, right? That's a different model. That translates directly with podcasting, much more so than just being behind the mic and being a radio guy, right? Those things matter when you're choosing a coach, when you're choosing a producer, when you're choosing who's going to guide you and help you. You need to make sure both things are going on. But I also think you want to be really careful with who you choose as your coach for this, because as he said, and we said, pros matter. Make sure you're choosing a pro that can really add value to the things that you need, hold you accountable in the areas that you need to hold accountable, but also walk the walk. Carl is producing an active podcast. There are so many producers out there who don't produce a podcast, who aren't in it doing it. They're not marketing their business through podcasting. He's doing that. I'm doing that. There's lots of people out there doing that. Go and find one of those, because if they're not currently doing it, they don't know how hard it is. They don't know how difficult it is. And if you want to market your business via podcasting, you need that perspective. It's really important to have a perspective of how it is today. Because if we went back to 2012, 2014, all those years, it was a lot easier and also a lot harder. So there were differences back then. There's a lot more technology changes, a lot more differences today. You want someone who's keeping up with that. So I was so glad to meet Carl Richards. Glad we met through Podmatch, because that is like my magic platform for getting to meet really cool, interesting people around the world and really getting to hear what his thoughts on the podcast industry is and on how podcast solutions can help your business. Hope you got that as well. So I'm Tracy Hazard. I'm always here every week with another great podcaster who's got some insights into the industry, insights into their podcasting journey, insights into marketing, growing listeners, growing guests, whatever it is that their mission is, what their purpose is. And I'm hoping that what you're finding is some gems in this process, some high-level tips. I also want to share with you that we've been doing some experimentation. We're doing some new experimentation over on YouTube, and we're doing some experimentation in partnership with what we call pod shares. And so we're really combining our forces and doing some things to help promote podcasters out there. So I definitely want you to check out our YouTube and see what we're doing over there, because lots of things are changing right now. So go check that out. And you can find us anywhere on social media and at thebingefactor.com. Thanks everyone for listening. I'm Tracy Hazard. Back to you next time with another bingeable podcast host.
You've been listening to the Binge Factor podcast. For more information on podcasting and videocasting success tips and tactics, please go to thebingefactor.com. And be sure to listen to our other show for podcasters called Feed Your Brand. If you'd like to be interviewed on this show, as well as featured in Tracy's column, please go to thebingefactor.com/guest and apply.